All right, here we are.
Hello, how is it going, everybody?
What's up,
Well,
John? How you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you, Dave?
I am doing well. I cannot complain.
I think this our first video where we've been like not together. I feel like
Uh,
something's a little missing.
yeah, I kind of think it is.
Maybe we did one before we were the Worldview Warriors. I don't know, but
Yeah, well, we did your intro video where your meet your admin video for you.
yes, that's right. That's right.
I think
Well,
that was
if you guys have been following us, we've kind of been following several different holidays, kind of giving as far as a basis, an explanation of whether or not we should celebrate them, whether they're biblical, or what problems or potential problems they might have. And this time of the year, obviously, tomorrow we've got Thanksgiving in America. And you'll see a lot of conflicting videos and information from various sources. And the general population, you'll see some that are kind of not celebrating Thanksgiving or upset with it. They kind of have this view that Thanksgiving is about Western Europeans uh, fleeing from religious persecution and then landing in the Americas and uh, basically having a Thanksgiving with Indians. They weren't able to farm, so they were planted grain and then they massacred the Indians. That's the type of video you might see online. But is that historical? Is what are the implications if it is historical, and how should we basically look at it from a Christian perspective? So Dave's going to kind of outline as far as what areas of that are truth, what areas are a little bit flawed, and what's the actual historicity of that claim.
yeah, definitely. So it's an interesting topic. It's kind of funny that you mentioned that we do stuff on holidays because I don't think that was ever our intent doing this. It
No.
was just sort of, like people freaking out about Halloween. Should we not celebrate it? So we took a look at that. And then our next big one was going to be on Christmas that we're going to do here in a couple weeks. But we actually weren't planning on doing one on Thanksgiving. I just happened to be kind of seeing some stuff online and, that caused me to do just some research for myself. And then really kind of here we are. So we've only been planning this like 2 days. So this will be, but we're glad you guys are joining us. So we'll just kind of kick right in and look at the sort of the original story. Most of us, this is kind of the grade school version. This is what you heard growing up, but hearing about the Pilgrims arriving on the Mayflower in 1621. 1621 was when they celebrated the first Thanksgiving, and basically what that was they were celebrating. They were celebrating really God's gift to them in terms of, discovering the new world, having a successful harvest, just surviving and that sort of thing. And when you look at the story, it's really kind of an interesting story. There is, like John said, there's kind of this narrative that they came over, they were fleeing religious persecution, then came over and sort of turned it around and religiously persecuted other people and that sort of thing. That's one of those issues that's not there isn't really a whole lot of truth to that. There were probably some groups that did that, but this particular group of the Pilgrims, that wasn't them. They weren't actually fleeing religious persecution. They came from the Netherlands, which was actually the most religiously tolerant country in Europe at that time. So they weren't actually fleeing religious persecution. They weren't and then another narrative is they came over, killed all the natives and then sort of took their land. That's another one that's not historically accurate. What had actually happened is shortly before that, a couple years before that, massive plague came and spread through the Americas at that point, and had just wiped out a massive part of the population. Really very tragic event. And what happened is the Pilgrims actually, when they came over, they had planned on paying the natives for their land, but when they got there, they basically found that it was deserted, and they eventually found Squanto, who was really probably about the one person on the continent who could have helped them to do what they did. He was someone who he was actually at one point sold as a slave and had lived in Europe for a while, and he had just recently returned to the Americas. He'd been freed by some monks. He had converted to Christianity. He knew English. So it was kind of crazy that that they met up with Squanto, and he taught him to survive, and a lot of just these necessary things. But anyway, so So yeah, so they had what we regard as the first Thanksgiving, when they celebrated with a group of about 90 or so of the natives. There's about 50 pilgrims. And they celebrated by, shooting guns and eating food and that sort of thing. The American way right there.
Pow,
But
pow.
so this is kind of the official story that you hear, or at least that I grew up with hearing in schools. I was kind of taken aback a little bit. My sister-in-law is a public school teacher, and they were told that they can't tell their children anything about any native and colonial relations. So their principal kind of just shut down them talking about Thanksgiving at all, which I thought was really interesting, because you look at this narrative, and there's a decent amount of history that supports this. Like, this is sort of a widely attested fact, and this is a good thing. Like, I think most people would look at this and say, well, this is a good thing, thankfulness and sort of togetherness and that sort of thing. But that's not necessarily the whole story. And if you've read a lot of different articles and blogs and stuff out there, there is this tie with Thanksgiving and sort of genocide, and this idea of just this entire indigenous population being wiped out. So we're going to look at a little bit of the truth that is there to that. So what a common claim that you'll hear is that, okay, yes, this event happened in 1621, but then later in 1637, this is when actual Thanksgiving sort of happened. And the narrative there is basically that there was a raid on a native tribe, and 700 of the natives were wiped out. Women and children were just slaughtered. And that ultimately what Thanksgiving is celebrating is it's the colonists celebrating the slaughter of 700 Native Americans, 700 human beings. And there's, unfortunately, there is truth to that. However, that is not the full picture as we look at the full narrative. So like I said, this took place about 15 years later, 1637. Now, like I said, there is truth, and there is sort of an incompletion there. So the incompletion is that this was not just a slaughter. This was part of sort of a mini war. And it wasn't just fought between the colonists and the natives. It was fought between sort of, on one side, you have the Pequot Indians, or Pequot native tribe. And then on the other side, you have the colonists, which was actually a group of several groups of colonists had teamed together along with two other tribes of the indigenous people. So this was something that was two-sided. It wasn't just, sort of a 1v1 there, but it's, of course, tragic nonetheless. And then at that time, they did declare a day of Thanksgiving over that, and did celebrate that, sort of the victory in battle. So that's kind of what happened there. Fast forward in history, another few years, another 50 years or so, there was another day of Thanksgiving with really a very similar incident. This dealt with the incident of King Philip's War. That was, again, it was groups of colonists along with several native tribes against other native tribes. And there was, it was a very bloody war. It was probably the bloodiest of these wars they had. There was more than 1,000 colonists killed, 3,000 natives were killed. A large percentage of the towns had been burned down, food sources destroyed, that sort of thing. So this was very tragic. And then another thing that sort of accompanied that era was there was a lot of selling into slavery of many of the natives. When they would, lose, many of them would be wiped out, and the rest of them would be sold into slavery. So this was, really just a dark and tragic event. And then again, at the end of this war, there was another sort of celebration of Thanksgiving for winning the war there. We're not necessarily going into, how just was the war or whatever that. Again, this is just kind of a brief overview and looking at really how to think biblically. All right. And then we can move on to the next section. John, did you have anything else to add to that section?
You had mentioned as far as like Squanto, when they met him, they were pretty much blown off course from their original destination and landed where his tribe was at. And that was where basically they found a deserted town, if I remember right.
Mm-hmm.
And they found as far as corn and different things. And when Squanto came back to his tribe, his area, they had all been wiped out from smallpox and other types of plague and things like that. And that's where I see some of the videos that will say, you know, they massacred, but it's just kind of a little bit of misinformation I've seen on that side. Would you agree with that from the research you've done?
Yeah, definitely. And that's, yeah, it's just tough because there is a lot of that thing that goes on, and that's kind of what we'll get into a little bit in the next section, is just some of those just horrible things that are associated with that era for the indigenous people. It's so that there really is a lot of, all the way around, there's tragedy for what happened to the natives. But yeah, there is definitely a lot of distortion there, because again, that is a common narrative that you hear. The Pilgrims came over and slaughtered a bunch of people and took their land. Or, one you'll hear is, okay, well, yeah, they hung out with them and celebrated this Thanksgiving for a couple days, but then later they, wiped them out and did all this. And again, there certainly were wars there, with some tribes more so than others. But yeah, a lot of it was just in fact, the vast majority of it was disease. Again, there's tragedy all around this. But sort of looking at the history of, again, we kind of went through a couple days of Thanksgivings. There was another one sort of after America won its independence. George Washington declared, days of Thanksgiving. That was sort of formalized by President Lincoln. So again, there's this theme of Thanksgiving that sort of had a lot of different instances. The first one that we know of was the one in 1621 that is sort of the official story that we hear, but certainly there were more there. But sort of, again, as we kind of deal with a tragedy here, we look at really what is ultimately a genocide of the natives there. Somewhere between 90 and 95% of them were wiped out simply by diseases. When the Europeans came over, they brought a lot of, like smallpox and measles and things like that, things that the natives didn't have the necessary antibodies for, and it just wiped out, a tragically large portion of the population. Let's see, there was a lot of different battles. There were raids, there were wars. Okay, so the 90 to 95%. So it's estimated, I'm sure you could probably find someone that would contest this, but it's estimated that there were around 145 million natives in North America in 1491. And by 1691, 200 years later, they were down to 15 million. And then sort of looking again at the history, by the time we get to 1800, they were only 600,000. By the time you get to 1890, 90 years later, only 250,000. So we just see this huge increase. And again, the majority of this is disease, but there's also, like I said, there's wars, there's raids, there's people being sold into slavery, just horrific treatment of these people. One of them that I think is probably the most tragic is 1863, the state of Minnesota set a reward for this is actually where the term or one of the original uses of the term Redskins comes from, is they would give a reward to anyone who could bring part of any native's their head skin, and you have actually people living off of this, people in the United States, living off of hunting down these these human beings, and it could be man, woman, child, killing them, cutting off part of their flesh, and then giving that to the government for money, and that was their job. So I mean, that's just horrific. Like, I can't even imagine that. So again, the reason we bring this up is not necessarily because this has a direct link with Thanksgiving, but just because this is sort of the same thing that is looked at, I think, when a lot of people who give sort of the anti-Thanksgiving, anti-colonial narrative, this is the kind of thing that they base it off of, because there are still very close associations here. And again, that is just incredibly tragic. So with that in mind, that kind of brings us to where we take a step back and look here, and really it brings us to sort of the meat of what we're doing here and what we're all about. And that is looking for a biblical response. How do we think biblically about, Thanksgiving in general? How do we look biblically at this horrific tragedy and this wickedness that was done, right here, not so long ago? So John, what would be kind of your initial thoughts on how we respond to that sort of thing?
Well, one of the things is, I mean, have a ear to listen first and foremost, because there is a lot of hurt, a lot of pain that the Native Americans associate with not just Thanksgiving, but what happened to them throughout as far as U.S. history. And so, like, the biblical response would be to mourn with those who mourn. Don't just overlook it
Yeah.
and see it as nothing. And the one thing that's easy to do as a Christian is to take like one side and say, nope, no, we weren't in the wrong in this situation, so we're not going to support you, we're not going to mourn with you. But there's that aspect where we're supposed to love our enemies, we're supposed to love our neighbors, we're supposed to love and show that compassion towards everyone. So a lot of times I think of the same thing as far as like the atrocities that happened to the Jews in the Holocaust. You have terrible, terrible situations happening to the Jews, and you should mourn with those people. But at the same time, you pray for your enemies, you love your enemies, and praying for those that actually did those type of things as well, because that wears on a person's soul as well, and you should pray for that person as well, because there is sometimes this weird animosity that happens between the two parts.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think you kind of mentioned on it, but just the general idea of like, don't, when it's so easy to just pick a side. And the problem with that is a lot of times that comes with a lot of just neglecting the facts, neglecting the sin. I think just as believers, we can't be afraid to call sin. Like, call it what it is. Don't just try to make excuses for things and or try to minimize things. Like, I mean, shoot, you think about like the tragedy with the all of the like pedophilia and stuff like that that's going on like right now, being exposed particularly in the Roman Catholic Church. And it's like, how differently might the world have looked at that if they would have been on the forefront of that, saying, hey, we are aware that there's some of this stuff going wrong. This is wicked. This is sinful. Here's how we're dealing with it. So again, that is just to say that we need to be honest in calling sin. We need to recognize that these people are image bearers of God. That's what gives them, worth, value, and dignity. Just because they were, different in some ways does not make them of lesser value. I think one of the other things we can do as a biblical response is to look for the good things, is to celebrate the good things. One of the dudes who's sort of a personal hero of mine is Roger Williams, who was the founder of Rhode Island. He was a Puritan pastor, and he's really kind of recorded or considered the founder of religious freedom as we know it. But he was somebody who did a lot for the natives. He was heavily involved. Obviously, like I said, he's the founder of Rhode Island, so he was heavily involved with politics and that sort of thing, but he fought very hard for the rights, the equal treatment of the Native Americans. He kind of had that same mindset of the Pilgrims. He said, yes, okay, this land has been granted to us by, sort of our king, but at the same time, there are natives that live here. So they actually went and tracked down different tribes and paid them to, compensated them for living on their land. So I think, somebody like him is just somebody that we can look to as a good example, is sort of almost like a light in the darkness. And he said, he was quoted once here, he said, boast not, proud English, of thy birth and thy blood. Thy brother Indian is by birth as good. Of one blood God made him, and thee and all. So again, just really recognizing the Imago Dei, recognizing the image of God in his neighbor there. So that's, I guess, one way, another thing we can consider there. And then I would say maybe the last thing, at least that I can think of, would be to just recognize the sin nature of man. When we look through a lot of tragedies and wickedness and history and that sort of thing, that should be a reminder to us of what the human heart is capable of. We as believers have a response to that. We have a solution for that, and that solution is Christ. And unfortunately, many horrible things have been done in the name of people who say they are Christians. But of course, our actions prove really where our heart is. Again, we need to not be afraid to call sin, but really use everything as a gospel opportunity, as an opportunity to talk about Christ. And my cat. Anything else you want to add to that, John?
Not that I can think of. You really nailed it.
Okay. Cool. All right. Well, like we said, this was just sort of like a mini kind of in between episode. We'll be back in a couple weeks, probably like the first weekend or so in December. I think we've been doing a lot of research on Christmas and sort of, pagan origins, pagan traditions. How do we look at that biblically? So
we might even
that
throw
is
heretic of the month in there.
Yeah, I got to have a heretic of the month. We had a suggestion to do. Sometime we'll do a list of our top 10 heretics that we'll talk about there. So that'll be good. But anyway, hope you guys all do have a great Thanksgiving. Again, like we were saying, don't be afraid to mourn with those who mourn, but at the same time, don't be afraid to celebrate with those who celebrate. So give God all the glory. Be thankful. And we love you guys, and we'll see you soon. All right.